Redditor 1. I used to think aliens were nonsense. You know the type. Those blurry photos on conspiracy websites, the shaky camera footage that could have been anything from weather balloons to somebody's drone gone rogue. But that changed on a Thursday night in December 2020, just outside Murphy, Texas. Now 3 years later, I still catch myself scanning the night sky, wondering if they're watching. It started with something as mundane as groceries. My brother James and I were unloading the car after a Target run. Mom had sent us out for last-minute supplies before his birthday weekend. The air had that crisp winter bite to it, the kind that makes your nose sting and your fingers feel stiff. The neighborhood was quiet, most houses already dark except for the occasional gleam of Christmas lights. "Don't forget the eggs," James called out as I grabbed bags from the trunk. "Mom will kill us if we forget them again." He was right. Last time, we'd left a bag in the car overnight, and the Texas winter hadn't been kind to the groceries. I remember checking my phone, 9:47 p.m. The notification screen showed a weather alert about an incoming cold front. That's when James stopped moving. "Matt," he said, his voice strange. "Look up." At first, I thought he was messing with me. He had a habit of doing that, especially around his birthday. But something in his tone made me pause. When I looked up, the grocery bags slipped from my fingers. There it was, hovering above our neighbor's 2-story house. A perfect black triangle, darker than the night sky itself. It was massive, maybe the size of a football field, and completely silent. The thing that struck me most wasn't its size, though. It was how it seemed to eat the light around it, like a hole cut into reality. "Are you seeing this?" I whispered, as if speaking too loudly might draw its attention. "Yeah," James breathed. Holy shit. The underside of the craft had lights unlike anything I'd ever seen. 3 red lights pulsed at each corner, steady and threatening. Between them, small white dots, arranged in patterns I couldn't quite make sense of. They reminded me of constellations, but wrong somehow, like looking at a familiar face in a funhouse mirror. But the center, God, the center. A massive blue light rippled like water, casting an ethereal glow that made the dead winter grass look alive with movement. I fumbled for my phone, hands shaking so badly I could barely unlock it. The camera app seemed to take forever to open. "Mom," I shouted toward the house. "Mom, you need to see this." That's when it changed. The craft, which had been drifting as slowly and silently as a cloud, suddenly tilted. The blue light intensified, and I swear I felt it. Not just saw it, but felt it in my teeth, like standing too close to power lines. There was a low hum that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. "Matt," James said, grabbing my arm. His fingers dug in hard enough to leave marks. "Something's coming out of it." From the center of the blue light, something began to descend. It looked like a rope or cord at first, but it moved wrong, like liquid mercury, catching the light but somehow remaining dark. I raised my phone, finally ready to capture what we were seeing, but the screen was dead. Not just off, dead. Later, I'd find out it wouldn't turn on for 3 days, and when it finally did, the battery had somehow reversed its polarity. The mercurial tendril reached about halfway to the ground when Mom's voice called from the front door. "Boys, what are you doing out there? The ice cream's going to melt." In the split second I turned to look at her, everything changed. The hum went from subtle to overwhelming, like standing inside a bell as it struck. The blue light flared so bright it left afterimages dancing in my vision. When I looked back up, the craft was already moving, accelerating at a speed that shouldn't have been possible without breaking every law of physics I knew. It crossed the entire sky in seconds, leaving nothing but darkness and questions. Mom didn't believe us, of course. She thought we were playing some kind of prank, getting into the spirit of James's upcoming birthday. But I saw how she looked at the dead phones, mine and James's both, and the strange circular burns in the grass where the blue light had touched down. That night I couldn't sleep. I lay in bed, staring at my ceiling, replaying every detail in my mind, the way the craft had moved, so precise and deliberate, the patterns of white lights that seemed to shift when you weren't looking directly at them, that tendril of impossible material reaching down toward us. But it was what happened in the following days that really started to unsettle me. First, there were the dreams. James and I both had them, the same ones. We'd see that blue light rippling and pulsing, and hear voices speaking in frequencies that human ears shouldn't be able to process. We'd wake up with nosebleeds and the taste of metal in our mouths. Then came the marks. 3 small triangles, arranged in a perfect equilateral triangle, appeared on both our right wrists. The doctor said they were probably stress hives. They faded after a week, but sometimes when it's very cold, they reappear. The strangest thing, though? The animals. Every dog in our neighborhood started acting weird that night. Mrs. Johnson's German Shepherd, who'd never made a peep before, started howling at exactly 9:47 p.m. every night for a month. The local shelter reported all their animals refused to sleep, standing at attention staring at the sky through their kennel windows. I tried researching similar sightings. Murphy, Texas isn't exactly known for its UFO activity. We're just a quiet suburb of Plano, the kind of place where the biggest excitement is usually a new restaurant opening. But I found others who'd seen it. Not many and not close by. But the descriptions were identical. The triangle, the lights, the impossible speed. One account particularly haunted me. A woman in Oklahoma had seen the same craft 2 weeks before us. She described the tendril, just like we saw, but she said something else, something I hadn't told anyone, not even James. She wrote about feeling watched afterward, about catching glimpses of tall, dark figures standing perfectly still at the edges of her property, about finding her security cameras mysteriously turned around, facing her house instead of the street. I started noticing things too, small things at first. Items in my room slightly out of place, as if someone had examined them and put them back wrong. The Wi-Fi cutting out at exactly 3:33 a.m. every night. The way my dog would sometimes stare intently at empty corners of the room, growling low in his throat. James noticed it too. We didn't talk about it much, but sometimes late at night, he'd text me, "You awake?" And I knew why he was asking. He was hearing the hum too. 3 years have passed since that December night. Life in Murphy goes on, unchanged for most people. But James and I, we're different now. We know something's out there, something that defies explanation, something that might have taken an interest in us. Last week, I found a new mark on my wrist. Not the triangle this time, but a perfect circle with dots arranged around it, like the white lights we saw under the craft. James has one too in the exact same spot. And yesterday, my phone died again, just like it did that night. When it came back on, there was a new photo in my gallery. It's completely black, except for 3 red dots arranged in a triangle. I don't tell these things to many people. Most wouldn't believe me anyway. But sometimes, on cold December nights when the sky is clear and the stars seem too bright, I stand in my driveway and look up. I think about that massive triangle hovering silent and dark above our ordinary suburban street. I think about the tendril reaching down, about what might have happened if Mom hadn't called us inside. And I wonder, no, I know, they're still out there, watching, waiting, and someday they'll be back. Because here's the thing about that night that I've never told anyone. Just before the craft disappeared, I heard something. Not with my ears, but in my mind. A voice, cold and clear as Arctic water, speaking words I didn't understand, but the meaning came through anyway. We'll see you again. I still unload groceries in the garage now, never outside, never under the open sky, because some things, once seen, can't be unseen, and some visitors, once they've found you, never really leave. The truth is up there, hidden in the darkness between the stars. I just hope I'm ready when it comes back to find me. Redditor 2. The worst part about that night in Midland wasn't the lights. It wasn't even the impossible silence. It was how the deer stared at us. 50 pairs of eyes reflecting our headlights. Every single one of them knowing something we didn't. I hadn't planned to be out there that night. Nobody plans to be in the middle of nowhere, Illinois at 2 a.m. on a Tuesday. But Kyle had just broken up with his girlfriend, and Josh thought a late-night cruise would help clear his head. Sarah came along because she always did, and I was the only one with a full tank of gas. That's how 4 college students ended up on backcountry roads, passing around a joint and playing old punk rock through crackling speakers. "Turn here," Josh said, pointing to a dirt road I would have missed otherwise. The radio had dissolved into static 10 minutes ago, and my phone showed no bars. Just empty fields and scattered woodlands as far as my headlights could reach. "You sure?" I asked, but I was already turning. The wheels crunched over gravel, and my old Civic's suspension complained about every bump. "Trust me," Josh grinned, taking another hit. "I used to come out here all the time in high school. It's perfect. No cops, no cameras, just corn and stars." Sarah leaned forward from the back seat, her face illuminated by her phone's screen. "No signal either. If we get murdered out here, nobody's finding our bodies." "Way to kill the vibe," Kyle muttered, but I caught him checking his own phone anyway. That's when I saw the lights. At first I thought it was someone's farm security system, 4 intense white spotlights arranged in a perfect square, beaming down into the field behind a line of trees. But something about them felt wrong. They were too bright, too precise, and they were moving. "Guys," I said, easing off the gas, "you see that?" The car fell silent. Even Kyle stopped fidgeting with his dead phone. "Holy shit," Sarah whispered. What is that?" The lights were only about 50 yards away now, hovering over the cornfield like some kind of angular constellation. The beams cut through the night with surgical precision, illuminating perfect squares of earth below. There was no sound, no engine roar, no helicopter blades, nothing but our own breathing and the idle of my car. I pulled over, killed the engine out of pure instinct. Nobody protested. "Get a video," Josh hissed, but Sarah was already shaking her head. "Phone's dead. It was at 660% a minute ago." Kyle and Josh checked theirs too. All dead. I reached for mine in the cup holder, but I already knew what I'd find. I rolled down my window, and that's when the true strangeness hit us. The silence. Not just quiet, but an absolute void of sound. No crickets, no distant traffic, no wind in the trees. The kind of silence that feels like a physical pressure against your eardrums. "We should go," Kyle said, his voice barely a whisper. "Seriously, we need to..." The lights shifted. The square formation rotated slowly, like a door opening in the sky. Something darker than the night moved within the illuminated space, a shape that made my eyes hurt to look at it, like trying to remember a dream that keeps slipping away. None of us spoke as the lights drifted behind the tree line. We watched their glow fade through the branches, moving north along the road we'd been traveling. "Follow it," Josh said. "Are you insane?" Sarah's voice cracked. "We need to get out of here." But I was already turning the key, my hands shaking so badly I almost couldn't manage it. Something deep in my brain, some primitive instinct that predated language, needed to know what we'd just seen. The Civic's headlights seemed pathetically dim after those impossible spotlights. We crept forward, the car's engine unnaturally loud in the artificial silence. The road curved ahead, and as we rounded the bend, we all saw them at once. Deer. Dozens of them. More than dozens. At least 50, standing perfectly still across the entire road and into the fields on either side. Their eyes caught our headlights and threw the light back at us, creating a wall of glowing points in the darkness. Not a single one moved, not a tail flicked, not an ear twitched. "This isn't right," Sarah said. They don't do this." She was right. I'd grown up in Illinois, seen plenty of deer in my life. They spooked easily, traveled in small groups, definitely didn't stand like soldiers at attention, blocking the road in formation. Then, as one, every deer turned its head to the right, looking at something we couldn't see. Kyle made a sound I'd never heard from him before, something between a whimper and a sob. "Turn around," he said. "Turn around, turn around, turn around." I threw the car into reverse just as the lights appeared again, rising above the trees to our right. The deer remained motionless, their heads tracked upward now, watching the lights ascend. As I backed up, my rearview mirror filled with reflected eyes, all of them watching something above my car. My back tire hit the soft shoulder and I felt the car begin to slide. I corrected, but not fast enough. We slid sideways into the ditch with a sickening crunch. "Out!" Josh yelled, already scrambling with his seatbelt. "Everyone out!" We piled out of the car just as the lights passed directly overhead. Standing there in the middle of nowhere, Illinois, we watched a shape blot out the stars. something massive and geometric, its edges too sharp to be natural. The spotlights beneath it shifted, forming new patterns I felt I almost understood, like words in a language I'd known in some half-remembered dream. The deer stood witness, their heads craned back, completely still except for their breath creating small clouds in the cold air. The silence pressed in around us, broken only by our own panicked breathing and the rapid drumming of my heart. Then, between one blink and the next, it was gone. The lights, the shape, the impossible silence, all of it vanished as if it had never been. The deer exploded into motion, bounding away into the darkness in every direction, their white tails flashing like tiny echoes of those terrible lights. We stood there for a long time, none of us speaking, none of us knowing what to say. Finally, Kyle broke the silence. "My phone's working again." We all checked ours, all back on, all showing the same time, 3:33 a.m. We'd lost almost an hour. It took 3 tries to get the car out of the ditch. We didn't speak much on the drive home, each lost in our own thoughts, trying to make sense of what we'd seen. The radio came back as we approached town, some late-night DJ talking about local news, like the world hadn't just shifted beneath our feet. We made a pact that night not to talk about it. Who would believe us anyway? 4 college kids out for a late-night smoke, claiming they saw impossible lights and mind-controlled deer? But we all knew something had changed. You can't unsee something like that. You can't unknow what we learned that night, that the world is stranger than we imagine, and sometimes the darkness watches back. I still drive those roads sometimes, always in daylight now. The field looks normal enough, just another patch of Illinois farmland stretching toward the horizon. But sometimes I see deer standing at the field's edge, perfectly still, their heads turned toward the sky, and I wonder what they know that we don't. Last week, Sarah called me at 3:33 a.m., her voice shaking. She'd seen 4 bright lights arranged in a square reflected in her bedroom mirror. When she turned around, there was nothing there. Nothing except a cluster of deer in her suburban backyard, all standing perfectly still, all staring directly at her window. Kyle moved to California, saying he needed to be somewhere with more people and fewer empty spaces. Josh threw himself into research, filling notebooks with theories about government projects and extraterrestrial visitors. Me? I don't drive at night anymore if I can help it, and when I see deer along the road, I don't slow down to watch them. I speed up, because sometimes, just sometimes, I see them all turn their heads in unison, watching something I can't see in the darkness above. There are things out there in the midnight fields of Illinois, things that move in geometric patterns and speak in languages of light, things that can stop time, silence the world, and command the creatures of the earth. I know because I saw them, one Tuesday night a year ago, on a back road in the middle of nowhere. And sometimes, in my dreams, I see those lights again, only now they're getting closer. Redditor 3. The funny thing about growing up in rural Tennessee is how darkness works differently there. In Memphis, 50 miles away, the night sky is just a black sheet with a few stars poking through. But out where I lived in '94, darkness had texture, depth, and sometimes things moved in it that shouldn't have been there at all. I was 15 that October, more concerned with algebra tests and whether Jenny Matthews knew I existed than with anything happening in the sky. We had one of those classic farmhouses, white paint peeling at the corners, wraparound porch that creaked when you walked on it, and my bedroom window facing out over Old Man's Field. The house had been in our family since before the Civil War, and Mom swore every weird noise was just the house settling. But what I saw that night wasn't the house settling, it wasn't anything I could explain. I remember it was a Tuesday because Rescue 911 had just ended, and I was sprawled across my bed, phone cord stretched to its limit, talking to Mike about our history project. Having my own phone line was a big deal back then, a birthday present from my parents who got tired of missing important calls while I tied up the main line talking about nothing with my friends. "Mrs. Henderson's gonna fail us if we don't figure out this Civil War presentation," Mike was saying. I wasn't really listening. Something over the tree line across the field had caught my eye. At first, I thought it was just the security light from the Thompsons' place reflecting off low clouds. But the Thompsons lived 3 miles away, and anyway, this was different. It was orange. Not that harsh sodium vapor orange of streetlights, but something softer, warmer, like a ember floating in the sky. Hold on, I interrupted whatever Mike was saying about Robert E. Lee. There's something weird outside. Weird how, you know how a football looks when you throw it? That shape, but orange. And it's just hanging there. There was a pause on the line. You're not messing with me? I swear to God. It's right over the trees across from my house. It's moving back and forth real slow. Let me call you from my mom's phone. I want to hear this. A minute later, we were on separate lines, both watching as this impossible thing drifted back and forth like a lazy pendulum. From where I sat, it looked about the size of a tic-tac held at arm's length, but without knowing how far away it was, that didn't mean much. It could have been the size of a car, could have been the size of a house. We should call the airport, Mike suggested after about 15 minutes of watching. My uncle works there sometimes. They'd know if it was a plane or something. The Covington Municipal Airport wasn't much, just a couple of runways and a tower that closed at sunset most days. But Mike was right. They'd know what belonged in our sky and what didn't. I still remember the conversation. At Covington Municipal. Hi, this is gonna sound weird, but there's something flying over my house. Son, if this is a prank. Oh, sir, I swear it's not. It's like orange and football shaped, and it's been moving back and forth for almost half an hour now. Nothing on our radar matches that description. Where exactly are you located? I told him. He said he'd make some calls. The object kept its slow dance above the trees. The longer I watched, the more details I noticed. How it seemed to pulse slightly, like it was breathing. How the orange glow would sometimes intensify just before it changed direction. How the air around it looked different, warped, like looking through old glass. My mom wants her phone back, Mike said eventually, but man, this is weird. Really weird. After he hung up, I kept watching. The crickets had gone quiet. I noticed that suddenly, the silence feeling heavy in my ears, even the usual night sounds of rural Tennessee, the distant dogs, the occasional car on the highway, the wind in the trees, all of it had stopped. Just me and that orange light, sharing the kind of silence that feels like it's waiting for something. Then, without any change in speed or direction, it started moving north. I watched until it disappeared, a dying ember swallowed by the night sky. When it was gone, the cricket started up again like someone had flipped a switch. The next day at school, during lunch, I overheard Lisa Carter telling someone she'd seen a weird orange light the night before. Then Tommy Jenkins said he'd seen it too, from his parents' farm about 5 miles from my house. By the end of the day, I'd heard 6 different people talk about it. But here's the thing, the part I've never told anyone before. After the light disappeared, I went to close my curtains and noticed something on my window. Right there on the glass was a perfect oval shape, like someone had traced the outline of a football. It wasn't drawn or scratched. It was like the glass itself had changed, become ever so slightly cloudy in that precise shape. When I touched it, it was warm. That shape stayed on my window for 3 years. No amount of cleaning would remove it. Then one morning in 1997, I woke up and it was gone, like it had never been there at all. But that same morning, every digital clock in the house was blinking 3:33, even though the power hadn't gone out. Sometimes now, nearly 30 years later, I'll be driving through rural Tennessee at night, and I'll catch a glimpse of something orange in my rearview mirror, just for a second, just at the edge of vision. And the radio will go quiet, and the crickets will stop singing, and I'll feel that same waiting silence I felt when I was 15. I never found out what that object was. The airport never called back. The local paper never mentioned it. Life in our small town went on like nothing had happened. But I know what I saw that night, what all of us saw. And I know that somewhere out there, above the dark trees and sleeping fields of Tennessee, something is still moving, back and forth, watching and waiting. Last year, I drove past my old house. New family living there now, new paint on the walls, new curtains in my old bedroom window. As I slowed down to look, I saw a teenager sitting at that same window, phone in hand, staring up at the night sky. And just for a moment, I swear, I saw an orange reflection in the glass. I didn't stop to warn them. What would I say? That some nights in rural Tennessee, the darkness watches back? That some lights don't just pass by, but leave marks that last for years? That sometimes the things we see in the sky see us too? Instead, I drove on, keeping an eye on my rearview mirror until I hit the city limits. But I think about that kid sometimes and I wonder if they've seen it yet. That orange football shape, dancing above the trees, waiting for someone to notice it. Because that's the thing about rural Tennessee. The darkness works differently there, and some lights never really go away. They just wait for the right moment to come back. Redditor 4. Pastor Dave wasn't the kind of man who saw miracles everywhere. In the 15 years he'd led our small Methodist church, I'd never heard him claim divine intervention for anything bigger than finding his car keys. He was more likely to quote statistics than scripture, which made what happened that summer afternoon in 2008 all the more remarkable. We were at Camp Wesleyan, 3 hours from home, for our annual youth retreat. It was that drowsy part of afternoon when the day's activities were done, but dinner was still an hour away. Most kids were in their cabins or playing basketball, but my friend Tommy and I were heading to the lake to skip rocks. That's when we saw Pastor Dave. He was standing at the edge of the prayer garden, head tilted back, completely still. This wasn't unusual in itself. Pastors at prayer gardens tend to pray, after all, but something about his posture seemed off. Less devotional, more confused. "Should we check on him?" Tommy whispered. I shrugged. Pastor Dave had been acting strange all day, distracted during morning devotionals and barely touching his lunch. Maybe he needed some alone time. But after 10 minutes of half-heartedly tossing stones in the lake, we looked back and he hadn't moved. His neck was still craned skyward, one hand shielding his eyes against the late afternoon sun. "Okay, this is weird," Tommy said. "Let's go see what's up." As we approached, I noticed Pastor Dave's other hand was moving slightly, like he was counting something. His usual warm smile was replaced by furrowed brows and slightly parted lips. "Pastor Dave?" I ventured. "Everything okay?" He didn't look at us, just raised one finger and pointed up. "Been watching these things for 15 minutes, he said quietly. "Can't figure out what they are." Tommy and I followed his gaze. The sky was that deep, endless blue you only get on perfect summer days, marred only by a single wispy cloud that looked more like cigarette smoke than proper weather. At first, I saw nothing unusual. Then, "Oh," Tommy breathed. "Oh wow." 2 objects, metallic gray and reflecting sunlight like mirrors, were moving across the sky. They were cigar-shaped, maybe the size of small planes from our perspective, but with no wings, no rotors, no visible means of propulsion at all. They moved with deliberate precision, like they were following tracks in the sky. "They've been doing this pattern," Pastor Dave said, his voice carrying that same tone he used when explaining particularly difficult Bible passages. "Watch." The objects were moving toward each other now on what looked like a collision course. Just when impact seemed inevitable, both craft made perfect 90-degree turns, like someone playing an old snake game on a Nokia phone. One disappeared behind the tree line, while the other, impossibly, inexplicably, flew directly into that thin cloud and vanished. We stood there, the 3 of us, watching that cloud for what felt like hours but was probably only minutes. The object never emerged. Finally, Pastor Dave lowered his gaze and looked at us. His expression was something I'll never forget, a mixture of wonder, confusion, and what might have been relief. "Well," he said, adjusting his collar, "I guess we just saw some UFOs. I'm glad you boys came over, because I was starting to think I was going senile." We laughed, but it was the nervous kind of laughter that people use when they don't know what else to do. What do you say when you've just watched something that shouldn't be possible? The rest of the retreat passed normally enough. We sang songs around the campfire, did trust falls, studied scripture, but something had changed. During evening prayers, I noticed Pastor Dave spending more time looking up at the stars than down at his Bible. That Sunday after we got back, his sermon was about Acts 2:19. "I will show wonders in the heavens above and signs on the earth below." It was the first time I'd ever heard him preach without notes. Years passed, I graduated high school, went to college, moved away. But I still visit home sometimes, and when I do, I always stop by to see Pastor Dave. He's retired now, but still sharp as ever. Every time I visit, he brings up that afternoon. "You remember those cigars in the sky?" he'll say, eyes twinkling. Still can't explain that one, can we? Last month, I went to see him in the retirement home where he lives now. He was sitting by the window, reading his Bible. "You know," he said, not looking up, "I've been thinking about that day a lot lately. Those objects, they moved with purpose, intelligence, like they knew exactly what they were doing." "What do you think they were?" I asked, though we'd had this conversation dozens of times. He closed his Bible and smiled. "I think they were a reminder." "Of what?" "That we don't know everything, that there are mysteries bigger than us." He chuckled. "You know, some of the deacons wanted me to stop talking about it, said it wasn't proper for a pastor to go around claiming he saw flying saucers. But I figure if God made the heavens and the earth, maybe he made some other things too, things we're not ready to understand yet." I visit that camp sometimes when I'm in the area. The prayer garden is still there, though the trees are taller now. Sometimes I stand where Pastor Dave stood and look up at that endless blue sky. I've never seen anything like what we saw that day, but I keep looking. Because here's the thing about faith. It's not about having all the answers. Sometimes it's about being comfortable with the questions. Pastor Dave taught me that, though probably not in the way he intended. Last week I got a text from him. All it said was, "Pax 219, look up." When I did, there was a single wispy cloud in the otherwise clear sky, looking for all the world like cigarette smoke. I watched it for an hour, but nothing flew into it. Nothing flew out. But I keep watching, because if there's one thing I learned that summer afternoon, it's that sometimes the most profound mysteries come when you least expect them, witnessed by the most unlikely people. And sometimes, just sometimes, those mysteries choose to reveal themselves to a retired pastor, 2 teenagers, and a wispy cloud on a perfect summer day. Redditor 5. I don't go to Sarah's river house anymore. She still invites me every summer, but I always find an excuse. Work deadlines, family obligations, anything to avoid spending another night watching the sky over Antietam Creek. She thinks it's because of the divorce, how her brother and I ended things badly, but that's not it. It's because of what we saw that night in July, and the pattern of disappearances that followed. The evening started normally enough. Sarah had inherited the property from her grandmother, 10 acres of Virginia woodland with a colonial-style house overlooking the creek. The previous owner had added a pool, which seemed ridiculous given the creek was right there, but on humid summer nights, that chlorinated water felt like heaven. We were floating on pool loungers that night, sharing a bottle of wine and catching up. Sarah was telling me about her latest gallery opening. She'd finally quit her accounting job to pursue photography full-time. I was half listening, mostly watching the fireflies dance along the tree line. That's when we saw it. "Is that a plane?" Sarah asked, pointing to a light moving slowly above the trees. I sat up on my lounger, water dripping from my elbows. The light was too low for a commercial flight, maybe 200 feet above the tree line, and it was moving too slowly, drifting like a leaf on water. "Maybe a drone," I suggested, but even as I said it, I knew that wasn't right. The light was too bright, too steady, until it wasn't. We watched it for several minutes, our conversation forgotten. The cicadas hummed their summer symphony, and somewhere downstream, a bullfrog started its nightly chorus. Everything felt normal, peaceful even, except for that light, meandering across the sky. Then it started to blink. Not like aircraft warning lights, not like anything I'd seen before. The pulses came in a pattern, 3 quick flashes, a pause, 2 long pulses, another pause, then a rapid sequence I couldn't quite follow. It reminded me of Morse code, but more complex, more deliberate. "Are you recording this?" I asked Sarah. She was already fumbling for her phone on the pool deck. But before she could open her camera, the light vanished. Not gradually, not like something moving away or being obscured. One moment it was there, performing its mysterious signal, and the next, nothing. The sky was empty, stars twinkling innocently as if to say, "What light?" We didn't see anything. We stayed by the pool for another hour, watching the sky, waiting for it to return. It didn't. That should have been the end of it. Just another unexplained light in the sky, something to wonder about over morning coffee and eventually forget. But 3 days later, Sarah called me. "Did you see the news?" Her voice was tight, controlled in that way that meant something was wrong. "About the Kingston family?" I hadn't. The Kingstons lived about a mile upstream. Their youngest daughter, Emily, had gone missing the night after we saw the light. The police found her bicycle by the creek, but no other traces. "They're saying she probably fell in," Sarah continued. "But Mark, the water's only 2 feet deep there, and they found something weird on her bike." "Weird how?" "Burn marks. Perfect circles, like someone had pressed hot metal rings all over the frame. And get this, her mom says Emily was talking about seeing lights in the sky the night before she disappeared." I felt cold despite the summer heat. "That doesn't mean—" "I know what it doesn't mean," Sarah cut me off. "But that's not all. Remember Mrs. Chen from the organic farm? She's gone too, just vanished from her garden. They found her pruning shears and her phone, still recording a video. The police won't release it, but my friend at the station says there's a bright light in the last frame." Over the next month, 3 more people disappeared along Antietam Creek. Each time, the pattern was similar. Strange burn marks, reports of lights the night before, no bodies found. The local paper ran a story about possible serial killer, but the FBI found no evidence of foul play. No tire tracks, no DNA, no signs of struggle. Just empty homes and burning questions. Sarah started keeping a log. She'd always been the methodical one, even back in college. She plotted the disappearances on a map, noted the dates, looked for patterns. She found one. "Look," she said, spreading her notes across my kitchen table. Each disappearance happened exactly 3 days after a light sighting, and the sightings form a pattern too. They're moving upstream, about a mile at a time. I looked at her map. If the pattern held, the next one would be at your house, I said quietly. Sarah nodded. 3 days from now. We decided to watch. Sarah set up her camera equipment, the good stuff she used for her gallery work. I brought my old night vision monocular from my hunting days. We positioned ourselves on her back deck, overlooking the pool and the creek beyond. The light appeared exactly where we expected, exactly when we expected. But this time, something was different. The blinking pattern had changed. Longer sequences, more complex. And this time, there was an answer. From somewhere downstream came another light, pulsing in response. Then another from the woods across the creek, and another. Sarah's cameras died first, then my night vision, then our phones. The air felt charged, like just before a lightning strike. That's when we heard it. A high-pitched tone that made my teeth ache and my vision blur. The last thing I remember clearly is Sarah's voice, strange and distant. They're not signaling to us, they're signaling to each other. I woke up in my car, parked in my driveway, 30 miles away. It was morning, Sarah wasn't answering her phone. When the police finally checked her house, they found what everyone expected by then. No signs of struggle, no body, just her camera equipment scattered across the deck, lenses melted in perfect circular patterns. They never found her. They never found any of them. The disappearances stopped after that night, and eventually the story faded from the news. The official explanation was a combination of accidents and runaways, despite the impossible coincidences. But I know what I saw. I know what we discovered. Whatever those lights were, they weren't random. They were coordinating, communicating, hunting. I still have Sarah's notes, her maps, her theories. Sometimes I take them out and try to find something we missed, some way to prove what really happened. But mostly, I just avoid looking at the sky at night. Because sometimes, just sometimes, I see a familiar pattern of flashes in the distance. And now I know, they're not signals meant for us to understand. They're signals meant to guide them to their next target. The river house is still there, empty now. Sarah's family tried to sell it, but no one wants property where people vanish without trace. The pool sits stagnant, green with algae, but on clear nights, locals say they still see lights moving above the creek, still blinking their mysterious patterns into the darkness. And somewhere out there, something is still answering. Redditor 6. Living in Cedar Valley means getting used to certain things. Dirt roads that never quite get graded, power outages every time the wind picks up, and houses so far apart you can blast music at midnight without bothering anyone. What you don't get used to are the things that shouldn't be there, the things that make you question whether you can trust your own eyes. Jake and I saw two of these things 6 months apart. We never told many people about them. Out here, folks already think you're a little touched if you live this far from civilization. Start talking about mysterious lights and vehicles that vanish into thin air, they'll write you off completely. The first one happened on a Friday night in November. Jake and I were heading back to my parents' place after a late movie in town. The neighborhood, if you could call it that, was pitch black except for the occasional porch light marking someone's driveway. Houses out here sit on their own acres, hidden behind trees and down winding gravel drives. The kind of place where you know your neighbors, but mostly by the sound of their trucks. It was around 11 p.m., and we were debating the ending of the movie when it happened. About 50 feet ahead of us, something crossed the road. Not like a deer or a coyote. This was big, bus-sized, and lit up like a Christmas tree. It moved smoothly, perpendicular to the road, gliding across our path like it was on rails. What the hell? Jake hit the brakes, and we skidded slightly on the gravel. Was that a bus? It couldn't have been. There were no bus routes out here, and anyway, it was way too late for any public transport. Plus, this thing was different. The lights weren't normal headlights or taillights. They were more like panels of light, evenly distributed across its surface. We rolled forward slowly to where it had crossed. There was no road there, no track, not even a trail. Just a steep drop-off, maybe 12 feet down into dense underbrush. Whatever we'd seen would have had to drive straight down that incline, but there was nothing down there. No lights, no movement, no sound, just cricket chirps and the tick of our cool. Maybe it turned, Jake suggested, but we both knew that was impossible. The thing had been moving too fast, too straight. There was nowhere for it to go. We sat there for a while, headlights illuminating empty air where something impossible had just been. Finally, I put the car in gear and we drove on, both of us glancing in our mirrors every few seconds until we reached my parents' house. That should have been the end of it. One weird night, one unexplained sighting, something to laugh about over beers. But 6 months later, it happened again. It was a Saturday afternoon in May, one of those perfect spring days that make you forget about winter entirely. Jake and I were in my parents' hot tub, enjoying the sunshine and planning a camping trip for the summer. The mountains rose up behind the house, still capped with snow despite the warm weather. I saw them first, 3 orange spheres, high up, probably around normal cruising altitude for aircraft. But these weren't planes. They moved in a perfect triangle formation, maintaining their distance from each other with impossible precision. "Jake," I said, pointing up, "tell me you see that." He did. We both watched as the objects began to move, switching positions within their formation like they were playing some complex game of cosmic tag. One would slide smoothly to where another had been, then that one would move to take the third's place, all while maintaining that perfect triangular shape. "Call the airport," Jake said. "They've got to know what this is." I grabbed my phone from the deck and dialed the local airport's number. The conversation that followed was strange. "Hi, I'm looking 3 objects flying around above the northeast section of the mountains. Any idea what those might be?" "Nope, there's nothing flying there." The voice was flat, almost rehearsed. "Well, I'm literally watching them right now. They're moving in a triangle formation." "No, there's nothing there. But I can see them. I'm looking at them as we speak." "There's nothing there." The man hung up. When I tried calling back, the line was busy. The orange spheres continued their aerial dance for another 20 minutes, before suddenly accelerating straight up and vanishing into the blue sky. Later that night, Jake and I tried to make sense of it all. The bus thing that vanished into nowhere, the dancing orange lights, the airport's bizarre denial. It felt connected somehow, like pieces of a puzzle we couldn't quite solve. "Maybe it's military," Jake suggested. "Some kind of test program? Out here in Cedar Valley? Nobody around to see anything, except us, I guess." But that didn't feel right. Military aircraft don't vanish into thin air. They don't cross roads that don't exist or play geometric games in broad daylight. And if it was a secret program, why draw attention with bright lights and impossible maneuvers? Years have passed since then. Jake moved away to Seattle last year, said he needed more city and less sky in his life. I still live out here though. Sometimes, late at night, I drive that same road where we saw the glowing bus thing. Sometimes I sit in the hot tub and watch the mountains where the orange spheres danced. I haven't seen anything else unusual, but I've noticed things. How the local airport installed new radar equipment but won't talk about it. How sometimes, on clear nights, all the dogs in the valley start barking at once, like they're seeing something we can't. How people who've lived here their whole lives never seem to drive that stretch of road after dark. Last week I got a text from Jake. Turn on the news. There was a story about mysterious radar readings over the mountains, things moving too fast to be aircraft, following patterns that didn't make sense. The airport spokesman said it was equipment malfunction, said there was nothing to worry about. Nothing there. But I know what we saw. Both times. And I know that somewhere out there, whether it's military or something else entirely, something is watching our quiet valley. Something that can vanish into thin air, that can dance through the sky like it's playing by different rules of physics. Something that knows we're watching back. And sometimes, on nights when the valley is especially dark and quiet, I swear I can see lights moving through the trees where that bus thing disappeared. But when I get closer, there's nothing there. There's never anything there. Redditor 7. My father never talked much about his life in Poland. The stories he did share usually involved long bread lines, the constant presence of Soviet troops, or his mother's legendary pierogi recipe. But there was one story he told differently each time, the only story that made his hands shake when he lit his cigarette. It happened in Krakow in 1984, a year before he met my mother. Back then, he was working as an electronics repairman, fixing televisions and radios for people who couldn't afford new ones. The communist government wasn't big on replacing things that could be repaired, and my father had a gift for making broken things work again. The first time he told me about it, I was 12. We were sitting on our back porch in Chicago, him with his ever-present cup of black coffee, me pretending I liked the bitter taste of mine. Marek, he said, using my Polish name instead of Mark, which meant this was serious. There are things in this world that don't make sense, things that make you question everything you know. He told me about that afternoon in Krakow. It was early September, the kind of day when summer reluctantly gives way to autumn. He needed groceries, bread, cheese, maybe some vegetables if the market had any worth buying. Back then, you couldn't just go shopping whenever you wanted. You had to know which stores would have what you needed, which days the deliveries came in. The market was in the old Jewish quarter, Kazimierz. He'd walked that route 1,000 times, past the ancient synagogues and crumbling tenements the government never bothered to repair. The street was crowded, as it always was in the afternoon. Old women with their shopping baskets, workers on their lunch breaks, children running errands for their parents. That's when it happened. He noticed people stopping, looking up. In communist Poland, crowds gathering to look at anything was usually a bad sign, but this was different. No one was shouting or running, they were just staring. At first I thought maybe it was a plane, he told me. We didn't see many commercial aircraft then, mostly military. But this, floating above the city, perfectly still against the clear blue sky, was a silver object. Not silver like paint or metal, but silver like a mirror, reflecting the sun so brightly it almost hurt to look at it. It hung there, motionless, at what he guessed was about the height of a small passenger plane. People around me were arguing about what it was, he said. Some said airplane, others helicopter. But I worked with machines. I knew how they moved, how they sounded. This made no sound, and no aircraft I knew could hover like that. As the crowd grew, someone ran to get a militia officer. In those days, the militia were everywhere, keeping order, checking papers, making sure no one stepped out of line. The officer looked up, spoke into his radio, and within minutes more officials arrived. That's when it moved. Like someone had drawn a straight line through the sky, my father said, his coffee forgotten and cold. No acceleration, no sound. One moment it was there, the next it was somewhere else entirely, like when you move a chess piece. The piece doesn't travel between squares, it just goes from one to another. The object repeated this impossible movement 5 or 6 times, each jump covering what must have been miles, yet remaining clearly visible above the city. Each time it stopped, it held perfectly still again, defying wind and gravity alike. Then, after its final jump, it simply vanished. Not like something flying away or going behind clouds. It disappeared like a light being switched off. The crowd stood there for a long time, necks craned, waiting for it to return. The militia officers spoke urgently into their radios. Eventually, people began to move again, return to their routines. But something had changed. The next day, my father continued, no one talked about it. The newspapers said nothing. When someone mentioned it at my workplace, the party secretary said it was a weather balloon and everyone nodded like this made perfect sense. But we all knew. We had all seen it. Years later, when I was in college, he told me more about that day. Details he'd left out of the childhood version. How the air had felt charged, like just before a thunderstorm. How watches and pocket calculators had stopped working while the object was overhead. How in the following weeks, men in civilian clothes had gone door to door, asking questions about what people had seen. They weren't militia, he said. They weren't even Polish, I don't think. Their accents were wrong. Some said they were KGB, others said American CIA. No one knew for sure. The last time we talked about it was just before he died. The cancer had taken most of his strength, but his mind was sharp as ever. He called me to his hospital room, asked the nurses to give us privacy. I never told you everything, he said, his voice barely a whisper, about that day in Krakow. He described something he'd never mentioned before. Just before the object vanished, he said he felt something. Not a sound, not a sensation, but a presence. Like someone was looking directly into his mind. For just a moment, he said, I understood something huge, like an ant suddenly understanding calculus. But then it was gone and I couldn't hold on to it. But it changed me, Marek, made me see the world differently. That's why he became an engineer, he told me. Why he'd immigrated to America as soon as the Iron Curtain fell. Why he'd pushed me to study physics and astronomy. He'd been looking for that moment of understanding ever since. Your mother, he smiled weakly, she always said I was chasing fairy tales. Maybe I was, but I saw what I saw. He died 3 days later. Among his personal effects, I found a small notebook, its pages filled with drawings and calculations. Diagrams of the object's movements, attempts to calculate its speed and size, and on the last page, a single sentence in his careful handwriting. They were studying us. After the funeral, I went to Poland, found the street where he'd seen it. Kazimir is different now. Trendy cafes and tourist shops where there used to be empty buildings and food lines. I asked some old-timers about that day in 1984. Most just shrugged or changed the subject. But one ancient woman, selling flowers near the old synagogue, nodded slowly. At the silver eye, she said in Polish. We all saw it. But you learn, in time, there are things better not discussed. She wouldn't say more, but as I was leaving, she pressed something into my hand. It was a photograph, faded and creased. In it, a crowd of people stand in a familiar street, all looking up at something beyond the frame, and there, in the corner, I could make out a young man's face. My father, 30 years younger, staring at something I couldn't see. I keep that photo in my office now, next to my father's notebook of calculations. Sometimes, late at night, I take them out and study them. The photo, the diagrams, the desperate mathematical attempts to make sense of something that defied explanation. And sometimes, very rarely, I think I almost understand what he was trying to tell me. Last month, I was teaching a physics class when a student asked about impossible things, things that break the laws of physics as we know them. I found myself telling them about a silver object above Krakow, about instantaneous acceleration and impossible hovering, about a moment of understanding that slips away like waking from a dream. They laughed, of course, the way people always laugh at stories like this, but one student stayed after class. His grandfather, he said, had been in Krakow that day, had seen the same thing, had spent the rest of his life trying to understand it. We talked for hours, compared notes. His grandfather's account matched my father's in every detail. The movements, the stillness, the feeling of being studied. Too precise to be coincidence, too strange to be fabrication. Sometimes now, on clear afternoons, I find myself looking up at the sky, not searching exactly, just aware. Because I know what my father knew, that somewhere up there, something is watching. Something that moves like a chess piece across the board of our sky. Something that, for one brief moment in 1984, touched the minds of everyone in a Krakow street market and left them forever changed. I still have his last note, the one they found in his hospital room after he died. It reads, "Merrick, keep looking up. Some questions don't need answers to be true." So I keep looking up. Because somewhere between my father's mathematical scribblings and that old woman's faded photograph, there's a truth trying to emerge. A truth about silver objects that ignore physics, about moments of impossible understanding, about why we keep searching the skies long after others have stopped believing. Maybe someday I'll understand what my father saw in that Krakow sky. Until then, I have his story, his notebooks, and the certainty that some mysteries are meant to remain just out of reach, pulling us forward, making us look up, generation after generation, into the endless blue above. Redditor 8. A couple of weeks ago, I was driving south from the DC area toward Charlottesville, Virginia. It was an ordinary afternoon. Bright, clear sky just past 3 p.m. The hum of the highway was monotonous, the same dull rhythm of tires on asphalt. I wasn't paying much attention to the road. My hands gripped the wheel out of habit while my mind wandered. Then, something caught my eye. A jet, high above, streaking across the sky. Its contrails were off, too thick, too deliberate, weaving through the air like ink bleeding into water. Chemtrails, maybe. I squinted, trying to make sense of them, when something else appeared, a bright white orb. It was like a star, too bright, too sharp-edged to be anything natural at this time of day. It hung in the sky, unmoving at first. Then, it began to follow the plane, shadowing its path like a predator stalking prey. 30 seconds passed, though it felt much longer. I could barely tear my eyes away. I opened my mouth to say something to the others in the car, but the moment I did, it vanished. Gone. No fading, no drifting away, just there 1 second, gone the next. I blinked. My stomach twisted in a way I couldn't quite explain. The moment passed in silence, but something inside me felt unsettled, like I had just witnessed something I wasn't meant to see. I didn't bring it up again. Maybe I imagined it. Maybe my eyes were playing tricks on me. That was what I told myself anyway. Until it happened again. Last weekend, I was at home with a friend, just hanging out. It was a little past 11 p.m. when we stepped out onto my balcony. The air was still, the city quiet. Then, my friend stiffened beside me. "What the fuck is that?" I followed his gaze, my breath catching in my throat. Another bright white orb, hanging motionless in the sky. For a second, we thought it was just a plane flying directly toward us. That would explain the intense brightness. But then it started to move, veering right while maintaining the same unrelenting glow. If it were a plane, the headlights should have shifted direction, dimmed or flickered. But they didn't. A pulse of unease crawled up my spine. My friend whispered, "That's not normal." Then the orb changed color. It shifted from pure white to deep orange, as if burning from within, before slowly fading out. We stood there in silence, unsure of what we had just witnessed. But the feeling in my gut was unmistakable. This wasn't a coincidence. 2 sightings in 4 weeks. I barely had time to process that thought before my phone vibrated in my pocket. It was 10:15 p.m. on August 5th, 2013, and the orb was back. This time, it moved left. I tried to laugh it off, but my voice felt wrong in my own throat. "Okay, that's creepy." My friend didn't answer. He was still watching the sky. I turned back and saw why. The orb had stopped moving. It was hovering again, perfectly still, as if it knew we were watching. Then it blinked out. Not faded, not shrank, just gone. I grabbed my phone and opened the camera app, but it was too late. My friend exhaled sharply, shaking his head. "You saw that, right?" I nodded. My fingers hovered over the screen, but I didn't know what to say. No one would believe us. I barely slept that night. I kept replaying it in my head over and over, trying to make sense of it. Maybe it was just some kind of drone. Maybe it was a trick of the light. Maybe. Maybe. And then I started noticing other things. Small things at first. A static hum in the air when I stepped onto the balcony at night. A flickering streetlight outside my building that no one else seemed to notice. My phone screen glitching whenever I scrolled past certain timestamps in my photo gallery. The feeling that I was being watched. It was stupid, right? Just paranoia. That's what I told myself. Until I saw the figure. It was 2 nights later. I had just gotten home from work, exhausted, and collapsed onto the couch. I was halfway through scrolling mindlessly on my phone when the motion sensor light outside flicked on. My apartment is on the 2nd floor. There shouldn't have been anything outside my window. But there was. A shadow. Tall, thin, standing just beyond the glow of the street lamp. Not moving. Not shifting. Just there. I couldn't see a face, but I knew. Somehow, I knew. It was looking at me. I sat frozen, my heart pounding in my ears. Then, just as quickly as it appeared, the light flicked off. I didn't move. I waited. Seconds stretched into minutes. When I finally worked up the courage to stand, I crossed the room and peered out into the darkness. There was nothing there. I barely slept that night, and when I did, I dreamed of the orb. Only this time it wasn't in the sky. It was inside my apartment, floating above my bed, watching me. When I woke up, my phone was on the floor, screen cracked, with no memory of how it got there. I tried to shake it off, but the feeling lingered. And then, last night, my friend texted me. Him. Bro, tell me you see this. Me. See what? Him. Go outside. I didn't want to. Every instinct in my body told me not to, but I did. I stepped onto my balcony, my fingers gripping the railing so tight they ached. The night was still, the air was thick, and then I saw it. The orb, again. Only this time it was closer. Much closer. It wasn't in the sky. It was hovering just above the street, right in front of my building. I couldn't move. My breath hitched, and for a second I thought I heard something. Something that wasn't the wind. A whisper, distant but unmistakable. My name. Then, just like before, the orb shifted, from white to orange. Then it was gone. I backed inside, locked my balcony door, and turned off all the lights. My phone buzzed again. Him, dude. What the fuck? I had no answer. I still don't. But I know one thing. It's getting closer.